Covered in this section, we're going to model the ground, and we're going to add some puddles to the ground. First, we're going to select the ground and everything that intersects the ground or lies on top of the ground so that we can move everything into a local view. That way our view is not obstructed by things like the roof trusses and the roof itself. So I'm selecting all the pillar objects against all of the walls and the middle pillars, along with the ground, all the floorboards and the planks that lie across the ground. And I'm going to press the / key on the numpad to move everything to local view. With the ground selected, I'm going to move the cursor to the center of all the vertices. To change the cursor position, you can press the Shift + S key for that menu. Now I'm adding a circle in the center with 5 vertices. I'm going to put this circle right at the base of every pillar. We're going to create a small depression and a bump on the ground as well, on the outside of each of the pillars where they intersect the ground. So in front view, I'm just extruding that up and then down. And I'm going to merge them to the center. We're going to add this bump on the ground at the base of every pillar, just to make it look like the pillar is actually intersecting the ground, and that the ground's actually responding to it. Otherwise, when you just have a cylinder intersect straight into a flat plane, it's not going to look realistic. You need to have a little bit of something there that shows that physics apply to this pillar being dug into the ground. There's going to be a little bump or a little depression around each pillar. So I'm just duplicating this to the bottom of every single pillar, in the middle anyway. We're not going to worry too much about the pillars on the side. Actually, I do put these on the sides, on the pillars against the wall. Now, as I'm duplicating these mounds, I rotate them a little bit, just to prevent the ground from looking too uniform. And as I duplicated each of those, I also rotated them a little bit. That prevents the ground from looking too repetitive. It just gives a little variation to the geometry. It's almost imperceptible, but it cuts down on repetition. I'm subdividing it a few times. We're going to create a little bit of a waviness to the floor. Since it's made of dirt, it's not going to be perfectly flat. We don't want the waviness to be too extreme, because our character is going to be walking on it, so we don't want it to be like a mountain. We want just enough depressions and raises here and there to catch the light differently and to allow textures to look differently on it, and to provide a slight variation to elevation so that when a character is walking, you can tell ever so slightly that he's going up or down, or if there's a pathway that he just started to walk on, things like that. Using proportional vertex editing, I'm just raising and lowering a few vertices here and there. One thing you have to be careful of is the floorboards against the wall. You don't want to lower the floor against the wall so that they're beneath the floorboards. Then there's going to be a gap and you're going to be able to see outside of the building. So I typically raise the vertices along the wall. Now you'll notice I haven't connected any of those bumps to the actual floor mesh yet. those objects I just selected, you can press the M key and it moves it from local view back to the global view. Because now that we're finished modifying the mesh and adding bumps according to where all the pillars are, we don't really need to see the pillars anymore. Now we can just work on connecting all those bumps to the actual face, to the actual ground mesh itself. And how I did that was just I erased one or two of the faces that are around these bumps, and now I'm just going through and manually facing them together, 3 or 4 vertices at a time. I add a few subdivisions here and there just so that the facing is nice and clean. If the facing on low poly objects is messy, or if the angles of the faces are too extreme, it's going to make the geometry look like hell when you're actually in the game. We don't have the luxury of subsurfing. I could technically subdivide everything one more time. It adds a lot of extra faces, and I don't think that's going to be necessary for the floor. We're going to have a decent normal map. We're going to have multiple textures splattered onto it, so any bad artifacts or any moderately bad artifacts are going to be hidden by all the texturing and the lighting. So it's not going to be so bad, so I figured why waste more faces on adding an extra subdivision. I'm just making these indents a little bit less extreme now. And I'm going to go take a quick sweep along the walls and all the pillars. Make sure everything looks right. Make sure there's no gaps between the floorboards and the floor. Now we're going to start creating some puddles. Now my first idea was to go through and erase a bunch of faces and then create a profile, a loop of vertices to kind of shape out each of the puddles to make it nice and detailed. This ends up not being that great in the end, and in the end I choose an entirely different method. So right now you're seeing me just going through and experimenting. The idea was just to draw the outline of each puddle and then extrude it down and under the floor and then face the bottom and then put a plane of water over the top. But because the floor is so low poly and I didn't add that many vertices to these profiles, the puddles end up looking like crap. So I end up deleting them, refacing the holes that I made, and just adding bigger depressions in the ground and lying a big plane of water or multiple planes of water in different areas at different elevations. Well, at the same elevation, but at different parts of the ground, which is at different elevations. So I'm adding some planes into these terrible puddles that I made. Now I saw how bad it looked, so now I'm fixating by adding a few vertices here and there to kind of make the outlines more detailed. I actually do end up keeping the small puddles on the side, along the floorboards, on the right hand side I believe, because they actually end up looking good in the end. But all of these puddles in the middle, they all suck. And they're all way too small as well. We end up making some pretty big puddles, and it looks good in the end scene. So now I'm looking around the scene, I'm really trying to fix this and salvage all that work. Although it wasn't a whole lot, I'd still rather not have to redo it. But it's the best choice in the end, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time to redo. If you want to experiment with things like this, and you're not sure how to approach a situation or something that you want to make, you should definitely consider duplicating this object, moving it into a hidden layer as a backup object, so you don't have to go through and reface everything and kind of reverse engineer everything, all the work you put into it. That puddle on the side there, that's a keeper. All of these little potholes look way too contrived. So that's about the point where I decided everything sucked. Now I'm going through and refacing everything. We're going to make some real manly puddles. Just doing a quick sweep, I noticed that some things were intersecting the ground. So before I forget, I'm going through and I'm fixing everything. That's a puddle on the side that I choose to keep. I'm going to stuff one of the windows down there a bit. Since it's a dirt ground, it makes it kind of easy for us to align everything because it can be intersecting just a little tiny bit. Everything's going to work itself into the ground a little tiny bit over time. So now I'm back to fixing my problem. I'm just going to whiz through this with time lapse, and then we'll get working on the real puddles. I'm adding an extra loop of vertices around there using the knife tool, just because the artifacts that I was creating, they didn't look that great. So I figured this is one spot where it might be useful to add just a few extra faces. Since we're going with a whole new approach to creating the puddles now, we can afford a few extra faces, since we're not adding them everywhere. So since the ground's at different elevations, we can simply stick a plane there, move it up and down on the z-axis until we get a nice looking puddle in certain areas. And that new plane that I added, I'm just adding a new material now, a nice blue material, just so I can visualize things better and have it stand out from the floor mesh. Now using proportional vertex editing, I'm moving some of the vertices down in certain areas to create a depression to add lakes in areas that I want them in. Not lakes, but puddles, whatever. And to give a good shape to the puddles, you can move a few vertices here and there. You can even make a few subdivisions here and there to make the outline of the puddles look more detailed or smoother, or to make the puddle bigger. Just getting a quick visual with the entire environment in view. Most of the time I'm working in local view, but it's good to go back once in a while and make sure everything's looking good with everything in the scene. I'm going to join those two puddles together to create one massive one. And you can see the outline of this puddle is pretty jagged. That's not going to look good in game, but we can add a few subdivisions here and there to smooth things out. Now back in the scene to see how everything looks. It's all looking pretty natural. Again, since I made modifications to the floor, I'm doing a quick sweep around the floorboards to make sure there's no gaps. Now I decided the trusses were a little bit too tall, so I'm going to move them down maybe 0.1 or 0.2 blender units. So right now I'm just going through and I'm selecting the tops of every single plank, being very careful not to select the bottom as well. And then I'm just going to move this down a little tiny bit. This is something I should have caught before I actually modified the meshes, but it's no big deal. It's just a little difficult to get in there and select all the tops of these planks. So then I moved the planks down a little bit so that they were a bit thinner. I now have to make sure everything else is moved down as well. Now we're going to create some fencing. So I just added a new plane, and I stretched it to the width of these two center pillars here. These are going to be long planks. And now I'm just going to extrude these vertices to create a nice outline for a detailed plank. A nice rotten, dilapidated plank. After I'm finished the outline, I'm going to face everything together, and then in top view I'm going to extrude this and give it some thickness. As soon as I'm done fixating. I'm going to change the thicknesses. I'm going to change the thickness of each area just a tiny bit, just to give it some variation. Although the thickness wouldn't vary that much on a plank of wood. Just a little bit will help with the realism. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to manually split the faces of each side of this plank so that I can set smooth the whole thing. Once again, you should use the edge split modifier. It'll be automatic. So now that we have one plank, I'm going to unwrap that in the same way I did every other plank. I'm going to fix the UVs up. I'm going to align them the way I want them. I'm going to see how it looks with the checkerboard pattern, and then I'm going to duplicate this one plank into two others and make modifications. Now we're only going to have to unwrap this one, although we're going to have three different planks with three different shapes, but I'm not going to change the shape significantly enough that we have to re-unwrap it again. If you were using any other texture but a wood texture or some other chaotic texture, which would look okay distorted, I would suggest re-unwrapping everything you make changes to. But since we're using wood texture, it doesn't matter, again, if there's minor and insignificant changes. It'll all look like it's part of the pattern. I'm selecting the back doorway real quick. I'm going to create a fake person out of cubes, just to give me an idea of proportions in the environment. Like, I'm going to use this person initially to scale the fencing to see how high I want it and to see how thick I want the planks. So I'm creating this guy about 6 feet tall, or 2 meters, and I'm going to base everything on the environment on that. It's important to have a lot of these fake little people around the environment so you can make sure that all of your proportions are real to life. They don't have to be anything fancy. I'm just making a little cube robot here. It just has to have a couple arms, a couple legs, be the general size and shape of a human being. I'm going to throw him in a couple different spots in the environment. First thing I'm going to do is put him in front of the fencing so I can see how high I want the fence to be. So I'm putting it about waist level. We're going to throw some pieces of plywood and sheets of corrugated metal up along all this fencing so that creates sort of a wall and a barrier. Since it's such an open environment, we don't want to leave it too open. So we'll be placing a lot of things along the fencing and creating walls so that we can create sort of a maze. Since it's such a large environment, we don't want it to be too open. So there I created a new plank. I made a modification to it to make it look unique. It looks like I am re-unwrapping these, although it wasn't really that necessary since they're not that different. But now we have our 3 planks, and we're just going to duplicate these in different arrangements all around the scene to create fencing. So right now I'm just rotating the view in, manually rotating these planks so that they match up with each of these pillars. I don't want them to intersect too much, but they have to be touching on each side. Now I used link duplication, Alt plus D, and I'm creating a new set of planks. I rotated the 3 180 degrees so that the top became the bottom. That way we don't have 2 of the same planks next to each other. And I'm kind of interweaving them now, since there's really not a whole lot of space. I'm going to navigate to the ref folder and open up the blueprints again, so I can get an idea of where all this fencing goes. Those black lines in the center of the environment, they're all fencing. You can see it kind of looks like a maze. It's going to be both fencing and walls there. I stretch those planks on the side there to cover the span of those 2 pillars, which is a pretty big distance. Later on I end up adding another vertical pillar there, but it's actually going to be just a regular beam of wood, just to create an extra support for the center of these planks. This one particular plank, I'm going to break off one of the pillars and kind of set down on the ground underneath that puddle. Again, I'm taking everything I need and going into local view. I'm just going to finish off adding these planks everywhere. Now for those super long planks, I'm going to create some support pillars in the center. It's going to stretch all the way up to the cross planks at the top of the pillars. It's just yet another plank of wood, nothing fancy. Now I'm going to duplicate that into the other fence. I'm going to make that object a single user since I need to modify it. And now with this short fence on the left side of the environment, I'm going to create a vertical plank that's only about half as high. It's not going to extend all the way to the roof. This is where I look at it and say that it pretty much does not look right. So I chop half of it off and just go for a bit of a fence post. Covered in this section, we're going to put some holes in the roof. We're going to create loose plywood for the roof, and we're going to fix the environment up a little bit. I move the trusses and the roof slats into layer 6 along with the roof so I can get everything alone. And I'm going to line the loops of vertices in the roof with the trusses. That's how I'm going to create nicely aligned holes in the roof between each of the trusses. Between the trusses and slats, I should say. I added a loop cut there by pressing the Control and R key and then sliding the edge up towards the top. So I erased a few faces here and there after I aligned all of the vertices and edges on the roof mesh with the trusses and the roof slats. I erased a couple of faces so we got some holes in the roof. And now I'm just creating a 4x8 piece of plywood with a little bit of thickness. I'm going to erase the face on the top since that's never going to be seen. And we're just going to lie this down across all the holes in a very disheveled way. Of course, we're going to leave some gaps between the pieces of plywood so that some light can shine through, and so that you can see outside of the roof, outside of the building. It's okay if there's very tiny intersections with those pieces of plywood. You don't want them entirely intersecting, but if it intersects with the walls on the side of each piece of plywood, it's okay. It's not going to be noticeable. Now I'm not doing anything fancy to align these on the rooftop. I'm just doing it manually by rotating the view and then using trackball rotation by pressing the R key twice. So now we got some holes in the roof, some plywood covering it. That pretty much does it. There's one little environment fix here. This pillar does not extend all the way down into the ground since I modified that ground mesh some time ago. So I'm just going to move that down real quick. And that should do it.